On November 25th, 1177, the Holy Land trembled on the rim of annihilation. Dawn rose over a kingdom that believed this day would be its last. At its head rode a figure who looked more like a ghost than a king. 16-year-old Baldwin IV, the boy monarch already consumed by leprosy. His hands, wrapped in silk to hide the decay beneath, shook violently. His face, ravaged by disease, disappeared behind a gleaming silver mask that reflected sunlight like the visor of a dying knight. Behind him marched 500 Crusader knights, exhausted from war, hardened by faith, and hopelessly outnumbered. Ahead of them, stretching across the horizon, thundered 26,000 Muslim warriors commanded by the most formidable general of the age, Saladin, the Sword of Islam. He ruled Egypt and Syria with an iron will, commanded armies that spanned deserts and empires, and carried a reputation so intimidating that fortresses surrendered at the mere sound of his name. The odds were obscene, a 52-to-1 disadvantage. Such disparity didn't predict defeat. It predicted extermination. Jerusalem's nobles had already accepted the inevitable. Ships waited quietly in harbor, ready to ferry the elite to exile. Secret treaties were drafted. Relics disappeared into hidden vaults. The holy city was preparing for the funeral of its own kingdom. But Baldwin IV refused to die quietly. Crowned at 13, expected to collapse long before adulthood, he ruled with a fierce clarity that unsettled even his enemies. Leprosy had stripped him of physical strength, but sharpened his mind to a razor's edge. Every movement hurt, every breath burned. Yet he rode at the front, strapped to his saddle so his deadened legs wouldn't slide from the stirrups. Saladin, by contrast, towered at the peak of power. At 40, he commanded more than 100,000 warriors, including 8,000 elite Mamluks, raised from childhood to master war. His 1,177 campaign wasn't a raid. It was designed to erase the Crusader states entirely. And on paper, he had already succeeded. Jerusalem had fewer than 1,000 men to defend its walls. Saladin marched with an army built for conquest. Yet in the space between these two unequal forces, history's most improbable battle was taking shape. A dying boy king with trembling hands was about to face the greatest commander of the century. And against all logic, something in the desert wind whispered that the impossible was about to happen. As the fiery heat of autumn bled into the chill of winter, the greatest threat the Holy Land had ever faced took shape. Across the deserts of Egypt and the plains of Syria, Saladin assembled the largest army of his career, a force so vast that chroniclers refused to believe their own ink. They described it as an ocean of steel and faith, a tide of shimmering armor, black banners, and disciplined cavalry stretching farther than the human eye could follow. Massive supply caravans creaked behind them, carrying enough gold, grain, and weapons to conquer kingdoms, not cities. In contrast, Jerusalem stood naked and exhausted, a once mighty Crusader state reduced to a flickering candle in a storm. After 80 years of struggle, the Christian strongholds that had guarded the Levant were collapsing. One fortress after another fell to Saladin's renewed jihad. Internal rivalries tore the Crusader lords apart, while disease, famine, and constant war drained their numbers. Across the entire kingdom, perhaps 15,000 fighting men remained, most scattered across distant castles that could no longer communicate with one another. And at the center of this unraveling world stood a dying boy. Baldwin IV could muster only 3,500 men, 500 heavy cavalry, including 80 Templars, who had sworn oaths harsher than death, 3,000 infantry, many of them farmers, carrying spears for the first time in their lives. When the king was carried to the war council, laid on a litter because his legs no longer obeyed him, his advisors begged him to remain behind Jerusalem's walls. The city might buy time. Perhaps reinforcements could arrive. Perhaps God would intervene. But Baldwin dismissed them with a fire burning behind his silver mask. "I may die tomorrow or in 10 years," he said, voice steady, "but I will die defending this kingdom." His hands trembled uncontrollably. He needed squires to pull on his gauntlets. He needed knights to lift him onto his horse. And yet he insisted on leading from the front. His men could barely watch. Hardened warriors, men who had seen limbs torn from bodies and cities burned to ash, wept as Baldwin was strapped to his saddle so he wouldn't collapse mid-charge. Meanwhile, at his luxurious camp near Ascalon, Saladin was almost amused. Reports claimed Baldwin's force was laughably small. His emirs confidently divided future territories, planning what lands they would govern once Jerusalem fell. And then Saladin made the mistake that would cost him everything. He assumed the boy king would cower behind his walls. Saladin believed he had read the board perfectly. Jerusalem sat exposed, trembling and undermanned. As long as he moved quickly, the city would collapse without a fight. So on November 23rd, with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat, he bypassed the powerful fortress of Ascalon. Why waste days on siege when the heart of Christendom lay undefended behind weakening walls? His massive army fanned across the countryside like a tide of armor and dust. Foraging parties scattered miles in every direction, hunting food, supplies, and plunder drums quieted. Commanders relaxed, horses grazed freely. Saladin's confidence infected the ranks. What threat could a mere 500 knights possibly pose to an empire's might? He didn't know Baldwin IV had already slipped into the wilderness. Under the cover of night, the dying king performed the impossible. With a body that betrayed him at every step, Baldwin ordered his meager force to march south, 45 miles in 36 hours, a pace so brutal even seasoned Templars whispered prayers between gasps for breath. When Baldwin fainted, knights lifted his litter onto their shoulders. When pain overtook him, Templars carried him like a sacred relic, refusing to let their king falter. The march was agony. For Baldwin, it was torment beyond imagination, but he pressed on, hunting a miracle. Crusader scouts swept ahead like ghosts across the terrain. They brought back scraps of hope, rumors of Saladin's divided forces, of foragers too far from command, of cavalry relaxing their guard. Baldwin needed only one gap, one crack, to turn a hopeless defense into a desperate strike. At dawn on November 25th, as the sky burned gold over the Levant, that crack finally appeared. The scouts returned with news that electrified the Crusader camp. Saladin's army was scattered across 3 miles of land, unprepared and unaware of anything approaching. But then came the number that squeezed the breath from every chest. Not 20,000, but 26,000. Some knights dropped to their knees. Others wept openly. One whispered, "We are already dead." But Baldwin, half conscious, sweating beneath his silver mask, refused to surrender to despair. He demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed onto his warhorse. His limbs trembled violently. His bandaged hands could barely form a fist, yet he raised one arm toward the sky. David faced Goliath with faith, he told them, voice breaking. We faced 26,000 with God. And in that moment, something shifted. The dying king became the spark of a miracle. By 11 a.m., Saladin finally noticed something that unsettled the smooth rhythm of his advance. Thin trails of dust rising from the northern horizon. He frowned, then dismissed the report with a flick of his hand. Probably scouts, perhaps a small raiding party. Nothing more. Jerusalem wouldn't dare ride out. Baldwin wouldn't risk his fragile life on open ground. But the dust clouds thickened. By noon, even Saladin's confidence faltered. The dark shapes on the ridge sharpened into distinct outlines. The black and white banner of the Templars, the golden lions of Jerusalem, armor shining under the blistering sun. The impossible had happened. Baldwin was coming to him. Saladin's vast host scrambled chaotically. Foragers sprinted across fields. Mamluk officers yelled conflicting orders. Some troops were miles away, others half-armored, horses unprepared, lines broken before they could even form. His army had loosened like spilled sand, and now a storm was barreling toward it. But Baldwin did not slow. He did not wait. He did the one thing every strategist insisted he shouldn't. At exactly 2 p.m., as the sun hung mercilessly overhead, the Leper King raised his trembling, silk-wrapped hand, and 500 lances, 500 symbols of defiance, lowered in unison, the charge began. What Saladin had mistaken for smooth plains hid a deadly truth. The ground was split by deep, jagged ravines, invisible until it was too late. They were harmless to an advancing army, but a nightmare for men trying to flee. As the Templar wedge thundered forward, something happened that no chronicler could forget. The elite Mamluks froze. These were warriors who had survived a lifetime of war. They had faced Byzantine cataphracts, Nubian archers, Mongol-like tactics on the steppe, but they had never seen 500 men charge 26,000. It violated every sense of reason built into a soldier's bones. Saladin himself stared in disbelief. His golden mace, symbol of his command, slipped from his hand and struck the ground. The next 60 seconds were hell itself. At 500 yards, a storm of Muslim arrows darkened the sky. Crusaders fell. Horses screamed. Dust rose like smoke. But the line did not break. At 200 yards, the sound of hooves became a rolling earthquake. The Mamluks braced, but fear crept into their eyes. At 100 yards, panic rippled through their ranks. Horses twitched. Men swallowed prayers. At 50 yards, even war horses sensed what was coming and refused to advance. Then the moment came when two worlds collided at full force. The impact hit like a mountain falling, and the Battle of Montgisard truly began. The collision came not as a clash of men, but as a natural disaster, as if two mountains had torn free from the earth and slammed together. At the very tip of the formation, the Templar wedge of 80 knights hit Saladin's half-formed center with a force that defied comprehension. The first rank of Mamluks didn't fall. They ceased to exist. 300 warriors were annihilated in the opening heartbeat, crushed beneath iron hooves or impaled by 12-foot ashwood lances that punched through multiple bodies before shattering. But the real terror came from what the Templars didn't do. They didn't pull back. They didn't reform. They didn't regroup. Instead, they kept driving forward, bodies and horses merging into a single spear of fanatic fury, punching through the Muslim core. The wedge split the center open like a wound torn across the battlefield. And into that widening rupture thundered Baldwin's remaining 420 knights, swords raised, shields splintering against Mamluk armor. By 2:15 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Saladin's 8,000-strong cavalry center began to buckle. Not fade, not retreat, but collapse, crushed beneath a force 16 times smaller. The Mamluks had never experienced anything like this. Their lines bent inward, their officers screamed contradictory orders, and their horses began to panic. Meanwhile, the Crusader war horses, exhausted, dehydrated, pushed beyond mortal limits, behaved like beasts possessed. They bit, kicked, and plowed through bodies with a savagery chroniclers struggled to describe one riderless horse. Its Templar master, dead, kept charging, trampling soldiers in a wild, unstoppable path that struck terror deeper than any blade. By 2:30 p.m., panic began to metastasize through Saladin's ranks. A Mamluk regiment on the left wing hesitated, then stepped backward, then broke. The fracture spread like flame racing through dry brush. Soldiers screamed that the center was collapsing. Others shouted that devils were riding against them. Some threw down weapons without being touched. And then Baldwin revealed the move that made this battle immortal. From the dead ground behind a line of low hills, terrain Saladin had completely overlooked, 3,000 Crusader infantry erupted onto the flank, shields raised and spears bristling. To Saladin's shaken troops, it looked like the earth itself had disgorged a new army. "We're surrounded," voices shrieked. Logic died. Fear became law. The battle was over. What followed was slaughter. By 2:45 p.m., the Battle of Montgisard no longer resembled a battle. It had devolved into a frenzy of terror and collapse. The Muslim retreat, already chaotic, now erupted into catastrophe. Thousands of fleeing soldiers sprinted toward what they believed were open paths of escape. But Baldwin had seen what Saladin had not. The open plains were a lie. The ground was carved with deep, jagged ravines, invisible until men were already running into them. And now, one by one, panicked warriors hurled themselves into those natural chasms. The screaming began instantly. Men fell in waves. Horses stumbled, legs snapping like branches as they plunged into the unseen trenches. Those who managed to stop only made things worse, because the men behind them never did. They slammed forward, crushing the fallen beneath their weight. Bodies piled into mountainous heaps, suffocating the living trapped below. Sand turned red, armor crushed ribs. Warriors clawed desperately upward, only to be pulled down by others falling on top of them. It was no longer a rout. It was a feeding ground for death itself. And then, at 3 p.m., The unthinkable shattered what little structure remained. Saladin's elite 2,000-man bodyguard, the finest warriors of the Muslim world, veterans who had stared down Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian archers without blinking, finally broke. They didn't retreat. They ran, with Templars roaring Deus Vult behind them like avenging demons. Even these hardened soldiers abandoned their vows and fled for their lives. Saladin realized his warhorse was too slow to outrun the oncoming wave of collapse. In a moment that would haunt his legend forever, he leapt onto a racing camel. The towering Sultan, ruler of Egypt and Syria, clinging to a panicked pack animal, became the final spark that erased all remaining morale. If Saladin ran, then no one could stand by 3:30 p.m. The battle stretched into a nightmarish chase spanning miles. Crusader knights cut down anything in front of them with mechanical efficiency. When lances shattered, they drew swords. When swords dulled, they grabbed maces. When maces broke, they beat enemies to death with their helmets. The desert floor became a river of blood, churning beneath hooves and bodies. Warriors crawled, screamed, prayed, or choked beneath the weight of fallen comrades. The ravines overflowed, sending cascades of corpses sliding downward like human avalanches. Later, Muslim chroniclers would stare at the devastation and write that this was not warfare, but divine punishment. A day when God himself seemed to turn against them, and as the sun dropped lower, the slaughter showed no sign of stopping. By 4 p.m., Montgisard no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like the end of the world. The ravines Baldwin had used so brilliantly hours earlier were now mass graves, some plunging 20 feet deep, overflowing with the bodies of men and horses crushed in the stampede of fear. The air stank of blood, sweat, dust, and death. Screams had faded into gurgles, and gurgles into silence. By 4:30 p.m., 3 whole miles of desert were buried beneath corpses. Armor glinted beneath the lowering sun. Severed shields, shattered lances, torn banners, and broken blades lay scattered between bodies piled so thick that crusader horses had to pick their steps carefully to avoid slipping on flesh of Saladin's once invincible 26,000 warriors. Fewer than 2,000 remained alive. Some crawled, some wandered in shock. Most lay motionless, layers upon layers of dead forming grotesque landscapes of twisted limbs and crushed helmets. The Crusaders themselves had suffered 1,100 dead from their force of 3,500, a heavy toll, but nothing compared to the obliteration carved into the desert. At last, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the sky a burning red that mirrored the battlefield below, King Baldwin IV signaled to stop the pursuit. His warhorse, quivering from exhaustion, slowed to a halt. Knights rushed forward to lift him down. The moment Baldwin touched the ground, his legs buckled. He collapsed like a man whose strength had been wrung dry long before the battle even began. But when his knights tried to support him, he waved them away. He insisted, with what little voice remained to him, on performing one final act. And so, in the center of a valley filled with 20,000 corpses, the dying king forced himself upright, leaning on 2 Templars, and began to pray, Non nobis Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. 500 blood-soaked crusaders, trembling with fatigue and awe, knelt beside him. Their voices rose into the dusk, echoing across the field of the dead. It was a sight so surreal that even hardened veterans later described it as if heaven itself had paused to listen. While they prayed, the spoils of conquest lay scattered like the riches of vanquished kings. Saladin's enormous supply train, enough to sustain 26,000 men, now belonged to the crusaders they found. Mountains of weapons, thousands of horses, barrels of grain and water, and Saladin's personal war chest of gold. In a single afternoon, the bankrupt kingdom of Jerusalem became wealthy enough to survive a decade. Meanwhile, Saladin limped into Cairo at the head of fewer than 2,000 survivors, his aura of invincibility shattered. His allies whispered doubts, his enemies sensed weakness. And across the Middle East, an empire trembled. The shockwaves of Montgisard did not fade in days or months. They echoed for an entire decade. The defeat Saladin suffered on that November afternoon scarred him so deeply that even years later, he approached the Crusader frontier with a caution that seemed almost unthinkable for a man of his power. The Sultan, who had once marched across the Levant like an unstoppable storm, now moved like a man expecting ghosts to rise from the sand. Privately, he admitted something astonishing. "I feared Baldwin more than any army." It was an extraordinary confession, for Saladin had not been shaken by a legion, or a mighty empire, or a divine miracle, but by a dying boy whose hands were wrapped in silk because the flesh beneath was too damaged for the living to bear King Baldwin IV. Jerusalem's Leper King, the miracle ruler who should have been buried before reaching manhood, continued to reign for 8 more impossible years. By 1185, his body was a ruin. He had lost his sight. He could no longer walk. His fingers were disintegrating. His lungs burned with every breath. Yet his mind remained sharp as a drawn blade. He ruled with strategy, diplomacy, and courage so fierce that even his enemies spoke of him with reluctant reverence. He held his kingdom together not through strength of body, but through sheer willpower. In councils, he was quiet but deadly precise. On the battlefield, even blind and carried on a litter, he inspired men to charge as if angels marched beside them. And then, in 1185, at the age of 24, Baldwin IV finally succumbed to the disease that had chased him since childhood. With his death, the kingdom seemed to exhale and collapse. Within 2 short years, Saladin returned, this time unopposed. Without Baldwin's mind to anchor the Crusader states, the political unity he had forced into existence dissolved like sand through fingers. In 1187, Jerusalem fell. The city Baldwin had saved with 500 knights could not survive without him. Yet Montgisard endured. It became the last major Crusader battlefield victory in the Holy Land. It became proof that morale can overpower mathematics, that belief can bend the arc of reality. It became a story where 500 faced 26,000, and one Christian and Muslim chroniclers, writing from opposite worlds, agreed on one haunting truth. Montgisard felt supernatural. How else could exhausted horses outrun fresh cavalry? How else could a blind, dying king outmaneuver a commander of legendary genius? Montgisard remains one of the most astonishing last stands in human history. The day a leper king's trembling, bandaged hands held back an empire, and for one blazing moment, the impossible became real.